Oh, Nintendo, I tried so hard to like you. But you went ahead and created this new thing called the Nintendo Creators Program, and it's a bunch of terrible bullshit. But maybe more importantly, its terribleness sheds a light on a literal ton of topics that are important to video games right now. So, dear viewers, strap in as we go on an adventure through time, space, copyright law, the internet, economic theory, and YouTube. You better hold on, because today we're in for a wild ride about how we do what Nintendo don't. Also, if you're wondering why we're using Minecraft footage in an episode ostensibly about Nintendo, just wait around. It'll all make sense in the end. So first off, for those of you that haven't heard of the Nintendo Creators Program, let me lay it out for you. YouTube has a system called Content ID, which I'll get more into later in the video, but basically what it does is compare the videos that are uploaded to YouTube to a giant bank of millions of pieces of copyrighted material, and flags the ones that have copyrighted footage without the proper permissions, and gives the original owner of the copyrighted material the opportunity to claim the ad revenue from the video, have the video taken down, or just let it use the copyrighted material. Now, Nintendo has started a program through which you can gain copyright use access to their game footage and characters for a 60-40 split of ad revenue between the video creators and Nintendo respectively for individual videos, or a 70-30 split if you register your entire channel. Sounds like a good deal, right? No. You may be thinking by now, hey, wait a second, I've seen videos containing Nintendo footage on YouTube and around the internet already, and Nintendo doesn't seem to have taken all or even many of them down. This channel I'm watching right now even has 2 videos covering Nintendo's games, in which they use game footage. Oh yeah, wow, that is interesting. It's almost like Nintendo is trying to extort money that isn't theirs out of content creators. What an idea! It's like Nintendo has become the 1950s gangster of the internet. That's a pretty nice video game you got there. It'd be a shame if anything were to happen to it. Hey, Dan, get back in the kitchen and get me a beer. No wife of mine is working. I don't like minorities much. This is the 50s. But to really deconstruct why this program is terrible, what it means, and why Nintendo specifically is the first company to do this kind of thing, we have to travel to the very beginning, back to the dawn of time, the early 1980s. Wow. And a little, seemingly unrelated game that would come out in Christmas of 1982, called E.T. for the Atari 2600. You see, in the early 80s, the video game industry was booming, with the market being worth, at its peak at the beginning of 1983, $3.2 billion. At the head of that wave was Atari, who, at the time, was one of the fastest growing US companies in history. They reached out to Universal Pictures to buy the rights to make the video game version of Steven Spielberg's E.T. By the time the rights and contracts were settled in late July of 1982, the designers at Atari had 5.5 weeks to fully complete the production of the game in time for a Christmas release. Not surprisingly, the game came out and was terrible. Now, you may be wondering what the fuck a bad Atari game for the 80s has to do with the Nintendo YouTube partnership program in 2015, but I promise it'll all come together. The failure of Atari's flagship game, combined with the flood of consoles filling the market at the time that were also full of bad games, caused a crisis of confidence in the video game market. If the video game giants at the time couldn't be counted upon to make good home console video games, and the flood of alternatives were even worse, then people decided they would just stop buying video games. A little side note here, for the sake of time, I am massively generalizing a lot of factors that went into this, but I am being generally accurate. As always, you have the GameWorks seal of guaranteed general accuracy. The video game market crashed, and by 1985 was worth only $100 million, a 97% drop from the $3.2 billion peak of just 2 years earlier. Many analysts at the time called this the end of video games, counting them out as just another historical side note, a curiosity of time that had flamed out and would be gone forever. But we can clearly see that this isn't what happened, and that video games went on to have a healthy and economically viable life as a product. So what happened? What changed? Well, Nintendo came along and changed everything. Nintendo released the NES, or Nintendo Entertainment System, in America in 1985, at the deepest part of the video game crash. And the NES sold surprisingly well, leaving Nintendo with a near monopoly on the video game market. This allowed them to exert an enormous amount of control over the industry. They forced third-party developers to buy NES cartridges from them, as there was a special chip inside that meant only Nintendo cartridges would work in the NES, which let them control who created NES games and how many they produced. There was also a certification process, limiting companies to only 5 games a year, and meaning that games could be submitted to Nintendo and turned down, leaving those companies to start over again or massively overhaul these games. And these weren't idle threats either. These were tools Nintendo used often to exert a huge amount of control over the industry. Nintendo also famously shorted retailer stocks of their games, sending sometimes half the number of games that were requested to increase demand and prevent the massive price cuts that hit the game market during the crash. They also tightly controlled the way their images and games were branded and displayed to avoid a crisis of confidence in the company like wiped out Atari. This created a strong resurgence in the video game market, leading Sega, Microsoft, and Sony to jump into the industry, largely resulting in the AAA game market that we have today. The result of all these, to be fair, douchey corporate practices on the part of Nintendo are a video game industry that thrives and exists today. Existing is nice. If you don't exist and are watching this video, please seek medical and metaphysical advice. So now Nintendo has a corporate culture based on a control of their image, brands, and market for their games, fostered in an era where this is necessary to survive as a video game company. But let's fast forward just a little bit to 2006, where the internet begins to come into its own and is matured enough to spawn a magical website called YouTube. Suddenly, opinions of the commonplace person are everywhere, and our culture largely changes. The barrier to entry for having opinions heard by a large audience goes way down, and suddenly with the advent of social media, how people feel about products and brands becomes a matter of common knowledge. And the intellectual property of big corporations has become the content of page walls and tweets and googs, or whatever the verb for posting on Google Plus is. Moral of the story, don't post on Google Plus. During all this change, however, and still to this day, because of the culture in which Nintendo came into their own, they still hold onto this philosophy of brand, image, and product control. So how does this work out with people's flagrant and usually accidental use of copyrighted material on social media? Well, now we have to dive into the incredibly interesting topic that is United States copyright law. In the United States, we have a legal concept called fair use, which protects certain uses of copyrighted material. I'm now going to read the entire exact text of the law, but to make it a little more interesting, I'm going to read it as fast as possible, all in one take. So see you like 100 takes from now. In fact, put the law up on the screen while I'm doing this. Notwithstanding the provisions section 106 and 106 say the phrase of copyrighted work includes such use by record of copies of foreign works either specified in that section for a purpose such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, including multiple class, use, scholarship, or research not infringement of copyright. To bring more than any of these the fair use factors that shall include. Number 1, the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of commercial nature or non-profit educational purposes. Number 2, the purpose of the national work. Number 3, the amount of substantiation of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. And number 4, the effect of the use upon the special market for the value of the copyrighted work. Nailed it! So, what's all this mean? Well, in practice, this law means that there's a few ways that a person can get away with using copyrighted material, even if they're making money from it, without paying royalties. It usually comes down to how much of a thing you're using, how transformative or performative your use of it is, and how your use of something affects other people's desire to spend money on the original thing. So, for example, The Daily Show can use footage of other newscasts because they're only using small clips, and IGN can use game footage clips because they're writing reviews. These works are fundamentally transformative. No one watches The Daily Show for the Fox News footage, and you don't watch a review instead of playing the game. They may affect your decision to consume the related media, but they aren't a direct market replacement, which is an important distinction because it makes it legal under fair use. As a counterexample, an entire movie uploaded and watched on the internet is, of course, an illegal infringement of copyright, because you're doing this as a direct replacement to paying money to seeing the movie at a theater or paying for a DVD or whatever. Clearly, bringing this all back to YouTube, Let's Plays fall into something of a gray area in this. Is the commentary a performance, a transformative work of the person playing the video game? Even more basic than this is the act of playing a video game in itself, which is always going to be slightly different for everybody that plays the same video game, a performance. No one really knows. And I mean literally, no one. So far, legal divisions of a lot of video game companies have come up with a legal framework called acceptable use, where maybe the company could get the video footage taken down, maybe they couldn't, but they've decided the free exposure is enough of an advantage to not do anything about the YouTube videos. Basically, it's the legal equivalent of shrugging your shoulders and going, fuck man, I don't know. This system has always made me mildly uncomfortable as it left the entire system open to corruption and abuse on the end of the companies. Because the YouTube Content ID system that I mentioned earlier heavily favors the large companies over YouTube creators, which kinda sucks, but I understand it. Most YouTubers don't have legal teams of 50 plus lawyers on their side, and as I pointed out, a lot of things on YouTube are in sort of a legal gray area, so it's in YouTube's best interest to keep companies happy to try to dissuade them from taking down like half of YouTube. The sort of abuses I worry about have already been happening on the small scale, with angry developers taking down reviews of glitchy and unflattering footage of their games that they didn't like. Just look up the Jimquisition Slaughtering Grounds debacle. Ugh, not great. But now, a much larger scale abuse of this system has occurred, and industry-wide abuse. The Nintendo Creators Program. So, let's finally dive into the specific problems with this Nintendo program. God, there's just There's so many, I don't know where to start. Okay, to do this most effectively, let's do a little thought experiment here and envision a situation where GameWorks signs up onto the Nintendo Creators Program. First off, we would register our Wii Sports and sequelitis response videos with Nintendo, so now we officially have permission to use the game footage that legally, as both the review show and clearly transformative performative work, we already have massive fair use permission and justification to use. Now, there can obviously be arguments both for and against Let's Plays and walkthroughs being covered by fair use, but this show that we do here, we clearly just use clips for educational game design topics and reviews of aspects of the game. I'm fairly convinced that any judge in the US would clear us for fair use. And what do we get for obtaining this extra assured permission from Nintendo? Well, we get to not get our videos flagged by the completely automated and corporately skewed YouTube Content ID system. We get to give them 40% of our money on the video, and we get to follow their outrageously stringent guidelines. In fact, let's look a little at some of the more troubling restrictions laid out in this program. I'm going to highlight two particularly troubling sections here. Part 1, the creator may not engage in any discriminatory, defamatory, libelous, hateful, harassing, abusive, obscene, threatening, physically dangerous, unlawful, or otherwise objectionable content in relation to the content, which is the shorthand for the Nintendo-owned copyrighted content, or the Nintendo Creators Program. And Part 2, creators may not post, upload to, transmit, distribute, store, create, or otherwise publish or send through the Nintendo Creators Program any content that infringes, dilutes, or otherwise harms the content or the Nintendo brand and image. While this sounds nice, the parts that worry me are defamatory, obscene, otherwise objectionable, and harms the Nintendo brand and image. In the Wii Sports video, while I overall praise the game, I point out the majority of flaws with the basic idea of motion controls, which is a pot Nintendo has pretty clearly put all its chips in. Would me mocking the basic tenet of their last two platforms be defamatory to their content or the Nintendo brand and image? Maybe. I don't know. It's so vague that it's impossible to tell. Now, I'm sure an official line from Nintendo would be, oh, we would never infringe on artistic and journalistic integrity. But according to their own guidelines, they could completely legally, because the program is a legal contract, do just that. And also to the obscene part, let's be honest, I like to say fuck. A lot. And I have a feeling that Nintendo's attempted politically correct-ass, family-friendly persona would not feel good about me putting an originally drawn picture of Mario and Yoshi having explicit relations across the entire screen of my video. Maddie, draw it. Feck, put it in. Ah, thank you. That's nice. And if I had to give all my Nintendo-related videos to Nintendo for approval, I have a feeling that they may not always be approved. Nintendo also has a list of approved games in this program, meaning that if I want to play, talk about, or acknowledge the existence of a game that's not on that list, too bad, I guess. So when we take all these separate facts together as a whole, what does this leave us with? Well, it leaves us with a company who, understandably, created a strict corporate culture of brand and content control to breathe new life into a dying video game industry, but refuse to change their ways as the industry and culture have evolved over the years. This leads them to come to a conclusion about the, to be honest, rather broken legal and copyright systems surrounding the internet. Nintendo thinks it needs to control what it sees as a use and interpretation of their brand that is spiraling away from their pure, family-friendly image. They clearly see this video game content as something that they own, and YouTubers are just co-opting from them. Just look at the opening page of the Nintendo Creators Program website. Join now and receive a part of the advertising proceeds for your Nintendo-related videos. Do you see a problem with that sentence? Around the section that says, a part of the proceeds, and your video, not two words away from each other? Nintendo sees themselves as the essential owners of any video with any of their content in it, and us, the creators, as the naughty children using their property. And as I said multiple times before, there is a discussion to be had surrounding where Let's Plays and walkthroughs fall in the copyright territory. But Nintendo isn't having a discussion. They're dictating an answer. And to get personal here for a second, our work here at GameWorks is transformative, a clear educational review, but Nintendo and their program make no distinction between fair use, transformative, or review works and full gameplay commentaries. I will not hand over control of what I say or how I say it to anyone else. Ever. For any reason. Maddie, Feck, and I work for weeks at a time on these videos, and though the creative control is the much more important part to me, there is something to be said for how huge of a cut 40% is. The way YouTube revenue works, Google takes half right off the bat, and an MCN or multi-channel network takes another cut. The reasons why and how one joins up with an MCN is a huge topic for another video, but we here at GameWorks are signed up with TGN. Without getting into specifics, the average MCN takes about a 30 to 40% cut. So let's say a video we make using Nintendo background footage makes $100. 50 of those dollars go straight to Google, leaving 50 left. The MCN takes, let's go with the highest estimate here, 40% of that 50, meaning $20, leaving 30 left. Nintendo then takes 40% of that, meaning $12, leaving $18 left of the original $100 for the person who actually created the goddamn video. In the share scheme, Google provides the platform, the MCN provides certain protections and services, and Nintendo provides Not being a dick for something they have no legal right to be a dick for in the first place, I guess? So, because of this, I'm sorry to say we are officially boycotting Nintendo games as topics for our videos here at GameWorks. I can't feel okay about what I say if I know and the people watching know that what I say could have been censored by the companies that I'm talking about. And even if I'm not being censored, my mile-wide anti-authority streak just wouldn't sit well with a big ol' implied "this message is approved by Nintendo" sticker across my entire video. It sucks because several people have been requesting of me that I make a video talking about why I love Skyward Sword so much, a game that is very near and dear to my little heart, and a video that I was excited to make. Nintendo, I wanted to sing the praises of an often maligned game of yours that I love, but now I can't do that, because very literally, you won't let me. It's hard not to take such a flagrant abuse of law, presented in such a glib and smugly assured way, kinda personally. I know this is strange to say to an enormous, faceless multinational corporation, but Nintendo, I'm a little hurt. And at the end of the day, I feel like I'm a fan that's being taken advantage of to squeeze every piece of revenue out of your intellectual property and brands as possible. It's especially egregious when the big companies or conglomerates like IGN are not engaging in your program and feeling no negative effects of that, because they're too big for Nintendo to take on and manipulate into revenue sharing. Instead, it's all the independent guys that are relatively defenselessly get the blunt end of the stick that are at the target of this program. At that point, when you're being that selective about the targets, it's almost just internet bullying. Ugh. But let it never be said that the show is negative. Who's saying that shit? Jim? I'll fucking kill him. I'll fucking kill that bitch. Negative my left asshole. Negative. So what's the solution to all this? Well, first we need to clarify and update fair use laws for the new generation. I'm pretty sure that a big lawsuit is gonna happen soon, within the next 5 years, 10 at most. The biggest YouTubers are becoming too well known and too influential to be dicked around like this for much longer. So soon we'll have a final decision about where the line falls on performative and transformative works on the internet, and dear God, I hope we get a judge on that case who is at least mildly technologically literate and informed, and we get a good decision. My personal belief is that straight walkthroughs with no commentary on certain limited linear games could be copyright infringement, because they act as a replacement for actually playing the game yourself. But that most Let's Plays with commentary and certainly review and discussion shows fall well within the transformative, non-substitutional guidelines for fair use, because they're being watched for the personalities of the person playing them and act as more of an advertisement for the game being played. But only time will tell. Secondly, companies should start implementing programs similar to Nintendo's, but obviously one would hope better, where they extend to independent entertainers and reviewers some of the same courtesies and opportunities they extend to larger established news organizations, like press clips, early access codes, and other such things, for a small deal, contract, or revenue share agreement. A large part of advertising for games can come from YouTube and other social media, especially from the larger, more influential people therein. And as the new, younger generation migrates those sources away from traditional news media, this will become more and more important, incentivizing companies to do these deals fairly and not in an abusive or coercive way. This is why we're using Minecraft footage today, he finally explains a fucking long time later, as a game that in large part gained and maintained its fame through its success on YouTube and the internet. It is a poster child for what freer, more open, and liberal ideas about copyright can achieve when it comes to the free exposure that social media provides. As I said, I feel like the market is naturally pushing us in this direction, but this is a troubling step from Nintendo. And as the program is currently getting an enormous amount of submissions, you better believe other video game companies are watching carefully. Third of all, companies like Nintendo that have ideas of intense, closely controlled branding need to realize that these ideas and values don't work well in the open, democratized landscape that we see evolving in the internet. As I said earlier, the barrier of entry for people's opinions to be widely heard is at this point absurdly low. So very often the way brands are seen and exposed to new people is entirely out of the control of the business that made those brands. This could be used to the advantage of the brand if done correctly, and can be an asset as opposed to something to fight against, as Nintendo seems to see it. These larger companies can only fight against the cultural current for so long before they either adapt or get swept away by companies that can adapt. So honestly, at the end of the day, the best thing any of us can do is to get informed, get in the discussion. Even if this video compels you to do more research and you come to a different or even opposite conclusion to mine, I consider this video a success, because it's not about me being right, it's about having a discussion and having the future of our media be controlled not by giant faceless corporations, but by us, the consumers, the people who are, in the end, affected by this media. And that's the way I see the Nintendo Creators Program. As always, I'll see you guys next time. Feck, how long was this video? Holy shit!